Hello everyone, this is Sam of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. And this is a lecture for patrons, Myth of the Month, number 24, The Epic of Gilgamesh. And this lecture will be brought to you by the letter Y. So the Epic of Gilgamesh is probably one of the most complex and difficult subjects to capture that I've talked about on this podcast, much like UFOs and conspiracy theories and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now that might seem a little strange since ostensibly we're talking about one specific text, one story that's not especially long by the standards of modern day books, and yet it is so tangled with ambiguities and contradictions. So I'm going to post this in two parts. The first dealing with the history or meta-history of Gilgamesh, where the legend and narrative of Gilgamesh came from, what it actually says, and how it's been received and understood in the modern world. And then I expect I'll post a second part that will analyze the story as a piece of literature for its symbolisms and meanings. But I might as well, as I've said before, begin at the beginning. He who saw the deep, the foundation of the land, who knew the world's ways, was wise in everything. Gilgamesh, who saw the deep, the land's foundation, who knew the world's ways, was wise in every matter. He studied seats of power everywhere, and learnt of everything the sum of wisdom. He saw what was secret, discovered what had been hidden. He brought back a report from days before the flood. He traveled a far-away road, was weary, found peace, and engraved his labors on a stone slab. He built the rampart of Uruk, the sheep enclosure, of holy Eanna, the sacred storehouse. See its upper wall that girds it like a cord. View its parapet that none could copy. Take the stairway of a bygone age. Draw near to Eanna, the seat of Ishtar, the goddess, that no mortal man could ever copy. Climb Uruk's wall and walk back and forth. Survey its foundations. Examine the brickwork. Were its bricks not fired in an oven? Did the 7 sages not lay its foundation stones? A square mile is city, a square mile date grove, a square mile is clay pit, half a square mile the temple of Ishtar. 3 square miles and a half is Uruk's expanse. Take the tablet box of cedar. Release its clasp of bronze. Lift the lid upon its secrets. Pick up the tablet of lapis lazuli and read out the travails of Gilgamesh, of all that he went through. So all of you may figure that you know more or less what it is that I just read to you, namely the opening of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the ancient heroic narrative that I'm going to discuss in this lecture. And perhaps for some of you, the first lines might be evocative of the beginning of the Odyssey, which opens with the speaker introducing the hero as, quote, that man skilled in all ways of contending. And further, the image of picking up an ancient chest, opening the lock, lifting the lid, might evoke scenes from Indiana Jones or King Solomon's Mines, and put us in mind of sitting and listening to a grand epic full of danger and daring and ending in triumph, as it's read out to us from an ancient tablet. But in fact, nothing about this is so simple. We cannot even say that this is the opening of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Nothing in that description is quite right. To begin with, as some of my longtime listeners might be anticipating I'm going to say, there is no Epic of Gilgamesh. For one thing, the ancient Babylonians and Assyrians who recorded this text that we're talking about called it the Gilgamesh series or the Gilgamesh cycle, or sometimes they called it by its first line, he who saw the deep. They never called it an epic. That is a form and genre of story that developed in ancient Greece and was carried on in the Roman and medieval worlds. And early translators of this Gilgamesh series in the 19th century anachronistically called this narrative cycle an epic, perhaps for the sake of prestige by association. And that's the name that is stuck. So we'll just have to be okay with that and accept it. And I will use that word sometimes in this lecture, as I did in the title, right? The Epic of Gilgamesh. But at the same time, we have to recognize and keep in mind that in fact the Gilgamesh cycle is something much older and in many ways stranger. It is more disjointed and paradoxical than any classical epic. It is repetitive, surreal, overtly symbolic, sometimes cryptic, and also deeply emotional and personal. And really, this cycle comprises a hodgepodge of different kinds of narratives: chronicle, origin myth, love song, morality play, funeral prayer, traveler's report, mourner's lament, and philosophical parable. And in a way, it can be seen to contain and prefigure in itself nearly all the known genres of ancient literature, crammed into a relatively short length. So the entire series in its longest known ancient version comprised about 3,600 lines of verse, on 12 tablets of 300 lines each. And this is only a fraction of the length of, say, Virgil's Aeneid, which is about 10,000 lines, much less Homer's Odyssey and Iliad, which clock in at 12,000 and 16,000 lines, respectively. So reading the Gilgamesh cycle gives the sense of dense symbolism and allusion worked into a fairly small number of tight, pithy lines of narrative and dialogue, often with veiled or hidden implied meanings. And many lines, such as in the opening that I just read, make reference to secret knowledge connected to hidden places and objects, like the sealed chest that we must open in order to read Gilgamesh's story in the first place. It ends not with a triumph, but with an ironic acceptance of life as it is, almost like a Zen Buddhist koan. And to go back to that opening passage that I read to you, it is not, strictly speaking, the opening of the Gilgamesh cycle or series, because, once again, there is no such thing. As I will discuss further later, there is no single standard narrative with a fixed opening. There are different stories of Gilgamesh and different edited versions or recensions of the collected Gilgamesh cycle that have been found from different times and places all over the Near East. And if you open up a modern-day translation of the so-called Epic of Gilgamesh, it will be based mainly on the longest version of the cycle that has yet been found, which was discovered on 12 broken tablets in the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, an ancient capital of Assyria. And I've spoken before about the discovery of the library of Ashurbanipal, and I mentioned the Epic of Gilgamesh in that lecture, and I'll link to that in the notes. But this is only one version, and other versions of the narrative begin in different ways. Another Babylonian version, which is a bit older than the one found at the library of Ashurbanipal, actually begins quite differently, by invoking Gilgamesh as, quote, surpassing all other kings, heroic in stature, brave scion of Uruk, wild bull on the rampage. So this so-called Old Babylonian recension emphasizes his strength and fearsomeness, whereas the version that I read a passage from, so to speak, comes from a bit later and it emphasizes his knowledge and his wisdom. And that longer version, the so-called Standard Babylonian recension, which was found in the library of Ashurbanipal, it tells, just to give a basic synopsis, it tells of a man named Gilgamesh, the king of an ancient city called Uruk, who rules in a tyrannical and predatory fashion until he meets a primitive man of the wild named Enkidu. The two become dear companions and go on great adventures, but in their exploits they insult the gods, who punish them by causing Enkidu to fall ill and die. The grief-stricken Gilgamesh leaves Uruk and wanders in the desert in search of deeper knowledge of life and death, and hopefully a cure for mortality. He manages to reach the one man who has attained immortality, but Gilgamesh comes back to Uruk empty-handed, but with greater wisdom and an acceptance of the human condition. Now, I just summarized more or less the outline of this recension, the so-called Standard Babylonian recension that was found in the library of Ashurbanipal, which is the longest and most intact version of the story yet found. But even it, too, has large gaps missing and many damaged lines, which are difficult or impossible to read. And many translators have tried to fill in the gaps using different older stories and recensions found in other places. But nevertheless, at least 400 lines of the cycle remain as yet unknown, and several others are damaged and can only be completed speculatively. Moreover, even if we put these gaps and missing pieces aside, all versions of the story are written in long-dead ancient languages, with few other surviving texts against which to compare them, and hence they are full of ambiguous words and phrases with unclear or shifting meanings. And this makes translation a lot like biblical interpretation, but 100 times harder. And when one combines that with the fragmentary and incomplete nature of the tablets and the often cryptic language and metaphors, the narrative is an exceptional puzzle, truly a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. So, hence, what I read to you a minute ago is not a final or authoritative or complete English translation of the opening of the cycle, which doesn't exist. Rather, it is just one new improvised English version based on what was found on Tablet 1 of the Standard Babylonian recension from Nineveh. In fact, it is my own version, which I cobbled together and lightly revised, based mainly on two different modern translations, namely Andrew George's from 1999 and Benjamin Foster's from 2019, with some small adjustments that I made to make it sound better or make more sense. Now, you might say that this is cheating, since I don't know the original language and I can't read the ancient text directly. But as I said, there are many lines where even the experts in ancient Babylonian don't know or don't agree on what they mean, or can't know what they said at all and must guess or simply fill in the gap with something based on taste and imagination. So in this way, you might say my guess or yours is as good as anybody's. And all of this, I think, serves to underscore what a totally exceptional text the Gilgamesh series is. The Epic of Gilgamesh is at the same time the oldest work in the entire Western literary canon and the newest. So the various fragments of the Gilgamesh narrative that have been found date from various times from the 7th century BC all the way to the 22nd century BC. And further, as we'll talk about later, there is good reason to believe that there was an actual historical Gilgamesh who at some point inspired the germ of the story. And if so, he lived probably before 2600 BC in ancient Sumer. In other words, before the Great Pyramids of Egypt were built. So really unfathomably far back in the early history of civilization. And the Gilgamesh narrative is the oldest, the most ancient extended narrative that has ever been discovered anywhere in the world. Earlier texts are just brief inscriptions or little lines in chronicles that might name a ruler here or there, but don't tell us anything about who they were, what sort of person, or what kind of life they lived. So if one is to write a history of humankind, as some historians have endeavored to do over the years, no matter where one begins, from the Big Bang or the creation of the Earth or the evolution of humankind, no matter how you slice it, the name of Gilgamesh is really the first individual personal name that you must mention. He is, in a sense, the first human we really know about on a personal level. And as we'll see, the epic really does give him a very personal story. So it is almost incalculably ancient. It does seem that the basic materials of the epic predate the Bible, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, anything that you can imagine by centuries or even a millennium. But in what sense then is it also the newest? Well, it's the newest in part because it was lost for about 2,500 years and was only found again with the excavation of Kuyunjik, just outside Mosul in northern Iraq, which turned out to be the resting place of the remains of the palace of the last great Assyrian emperor Ashurbanipal. And those were only excavated beginning in the 1850s. And moreover, the ancient cuneiform tablets that were uncovered only started to be pieced together and translated by Victorian British and German scholars in the late 1800s, really just in time for the beginning of the modernist movement in literature. And because of the age and the fragmentary nature and the ambiguity of this text, and the fact that it has had to be pieced together from different sources around the ancient Near East, it doesn't have any final or fixed form. And so anytime anyone tries to quote from the so-called Epic of Gilgamesh, they're always in some way reconstructing and reinventing it. They're always choosing what sources to draw upon, how to understand them, how to piece them together. So it is always really a work in progress. There is no fixed final form of this story. It is truly a living story. The poem has no author. The standard Babylonian recension that was found in Nineveh does name an editor who reportedly collected and stitched together the materials in that recension. But none of the ancient tablets name an author or a speaker. It evidently was just understood to be the product of centuries of transmission and revision, and that really is what it continues to be today. So the kind of meta-story, you could say, the meta-history of the Epic of Gilgamesh is really of an evolving work, a collective composition that has been worked on and revised over really the entire history of civilization for more than 4,000 years, interrupted only by a gap of about 2,500 years. So as I'll say again, I think at the end, in this way and in other ways as well, I believe the Epic of Gilgamesh is really the story of civilization. It is the myth of civilization itself. But this point, to go back for a moment, this point about the epic always being a work in progress, always being renewed and reinvented, that is a point that is very central to a recent book by the British scholar Michael Schmidt called Gilgamesh, the Life of a Poem. And this is a very interesting and insightful book in a lot of ways, and Michael Schmidt points out very skillfully how so many versions and translations of the epic have tried to kind of paper over its strangeness, how deeply ancient it is, how alien it is in many ways to our modern assumptions and sensibilities, and how easy it is to fall prey to this temptation to modernize Gilgamesh or to turn it into something else, into a verse play or an epic that is not really what it is. And that's a very good point and well taken. But I do think also that in a number of points, Michael Schmidt really goes overboard with this and overlooks or erases the ways in which Gilgamesh is very fresh and immediate and understandable, I would say, to just about any human audience. And just for example, he discusses the figures of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, which I mentioned as the king who goes through a series of trials and journeys, and his close companion, the sort of man of the wild Enkidu, who dies around the middle of the story. And in analyzing the first tablet, the sort of first of the 12 sections of the cycle, Michael Schmidt points out how spare and simple and austere the narrative is, and how quickly the events unfold. And he writes, quote, "I generally speak here of players or figures rather than characters in Gilgamesh. Character suggests psychological and emotional dimensions, strictly anachronistic in the context of Gilgamesh, even in relation to Enkidu and Gilgamesh himself. Players emphasizes the dramatic relations between figures who lack significant interiority and the abundance of repetitive, stylized dialogue. At times we might imagine that we are reading an ancient play script and not an ancient poem. Players' delays are trying to identify motive and attribute feelings that have little bearing on the original. Both players overcome their weaknesses without too much of a struggle through dialogue and repetition. They express rather stiffly what the story requires them to feel." End quote. So you may imagine I found this passage extremely puzzling when I read Michael Schmidt's book, and I've often thought about it and turned back to it. It's strange that he would say there isn't too much struggle in these characters' evolution. The whole story is struggle, including death, both for the one who dies and the survivor who has to go through his grief. I also don't quite understand what he means by they express, quote, what the story requires them to feel. Is he saying their feelings are contrived or don't make sense? Or don't all characters feel feelings that make sense in the context of the story? I don't quite know what he means. And so this is perhaps the most important instance where I think Michael Schmidt goes too far in trying to say that Gilgamesh is somehow fundamentally alien and inaccessible to us. And I would say, and as I'm going to try to illustrate, I think that the other half of the great miracle of the Epic of Gilgamesh, other than the fact that it was rediscovered and has survived through the millennia to be read and discussed all these thousands of years later, the other half of the miracle is the fact that so much of it is so immediate and relatable. And that ultimately, I think it speaks to basic human trials and dilemmas, even you could say to the most basic human condition, which is the clash between love and mortality. So in a few minutes, I will talk in more detail about exactly what is in this narrative cycle, the different events and figures and places. But first, I'll give a basic historical background of just where this story came from and the different versions and the evolution of the story as best as we can reconstruct it. Then I'll go through the storyline itself in more detail. And then I'll discuss the literary style and qualities of the cycle, the ways that it has been received and the impact that it has had since its rediscovery in modern times, and the commonalities and points of comparison that one can see between the Gilgamesh cycle and other known bodies of myth, including biblical and Greco-Roman. And then finally, I'll examine some of the different levels of meaning that can be found in the story: political, psychological, and philosophical, and ultimately how I think it can be seen as a commentary on civilization as a form of the human condition. So firstly, just to give some basic historico-geographic background, just speaking off the cuff, this story comes, of course, from ancient Mesopotamia, the land between and around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in the Near East. And as many of you surely know, the earliest known civilization in the sense of large permanent towns, cities, writing, first arose, as far as we know, in southern Mesopotamia, basically along the banks of the lower Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So this area is complete desert, but crops can be grown very well in the watered and fertile soil along the banks of the two rivers. So it seems that early cities arose in that area, including the cities of Ur, Uruk, and Nippur in the 3000s BC. And the people of that region were Sumerian. So, in other words, they were not Semitic or Indo-European. They didn't belong to any known ethno-linguistic group that we can name. Their origins are mysterious. We don't know how they got there. And their language does survive in written texts, and it seems to be totally unique and independent, unrelated to any other known language in the world. And these cities rose and flourished and were the centers of trade and power for well over 1,000 years. But over this era that we're talking about in ancient Mesopotamia, the center of power, it seems, gradually shifted northward, from Sumer in the lower Tigris and Euphrates valleys, eventually to the central area of Mesopotamia, and then finally the northern area of upper Mesopotamia. So there was a sort of translation from south to north over the course of millennia. So first, Sumer was conquered for the first time by a new power, by Akkad, specifically led by the conquering king Sargon of Akkad around 2300 BC. And he set up a ruling dynasty over the whole region, which didn't last all that long, a bit less than 200 years, which by Mesopotamian standards is not very long. and eventually power reverted back to the Sumerian cities. But then another new power center arose, the city of Babylon, basically on the middle Euphrates River in the center of Mesopotamia, in an area where the Tigris and Euphrates come close together. So it was a very strategically located city, and gradually Babylon rose to become the imperial power, dominating most of Mesopotamia around 1800 BC or so. And you have what's called the Early Babylonian or Old Babylonian Age. And that involves famous figures like Hammurabi and his code of laws and all of that. But gradually Babylon went into decline as well. So in the mid-1000s BC, around 1500 or so, other tribes and nations from the uplands to the north and the east, including the Hittites from the northwest in what's now Anatolia, and the Kassites, who are totally mysterious but might have come from Persia to the east, they invade down and dominate large parts of Mesopotamia until the Bronze Age collapse in the 1100s BC. So at that point, there's a widespread breakdown of urban civilization all around Asia, North Africa, the Mediterranean. And this hits Mesopotamia until, as in many other places, a new power arises, a new power that exploits horses and iron weapons. And in Mesopotamia, that's the Assyrians, who first are based in their city of Ashur on the upper Tigris River. So these are people who live on the sort of grassier steppe lands in the northern part of Mesopotamia, and they arise and become the new great imperial power, not only dominate Mesopotamia, but conquer most of the Near East through the early first millennium BC, right? And they really rise to become a great superpower in the 700s and 600s BC. And as I discussed in my lecture on the library of Ashurbanipal, they eventually moved their capital even further up to the new city of Nineveh, which is a splendorous capital under the rule of the sort of last great Assyrian emperor Ashurbanipal in the 600s BC. But after his death, the Assyrian Empire also falls to invasions and rebellions, and you have another period of fragmentation until the Persians take over. But we won't get into that. So this is the sort of world, right? The rise and fall of different dynasties, different empires, and the gradual movement, transfer of the center of gravity from Sumer in the south to Babylon in the center and eventually to Assyria in the north. And all through this era, we're talking about, more than 2,000 years here, stories are told about Gilgamesh. As I said earlier, there is good reason to think that there was a historical Gilgamesh, and that in some way, some aspects of these stories echo some sort of real events. So there are inscriptions that have been found at various sites around Lower Mesopotamia that make reference to a ruler named Gilgamesh, and they have certain resonances with what we see in what we now call the Epic of Gilgamesh. So one of them cites Gilgamesh as the sponsor of the building of a great temple in one of the Sumerian cities, and that seems to resonate with what we're told in the Epic, that Gilgamesh was a sponsor and patron of building, and specifically the great temple of Eanna, dedicated to Ishtar in Uruk. There is another inscription that's been found from even earlier, possibly Gilgamesh's real lifetime, which refers to him as being the chosen one or favorite of the god Utu, and that is the ancient Sumerian name of the sun god, the solar deity, who then shows up in the Epic of Gilgamesh as his sponsor and patron, but he's called Shamash, which is simply the Babylonian equivalent of the Sumerian Utu. And perhaps most significantly of all, there are surviving very ancient copies from before 2000 BC of the so-called Sumerian king list. So this is just a simple listing of the supposed main rulers of Sumer in very ancient times, and it gives their names and the supposed lengths of their reigns. And Gilgamesh is listed in these king lists as the 5th king of Uruk after the Great Flood. So right from this very early era, we know that Sumerians were speaking of a great flood that had happened sometime far back in the distant past, and they sort of divided history into antediluvian and postdiluvian, before the flood and after the flood. So Gilgamesh is listed as the 5th king of Uruk after the flood. And what is more, he occupies this very interesting and special position in the list, because when one looks at the earliest rulers, they are said to have unbelievably long reigns of hundreds or thousands of years. So this is obviously sort of distorted or exaggerated myth. When you get to Gilgamesh, it says his reign is 136 years. So that's also impossibly long, but not so exaggerated as those earlier rulers. Then subsequent to Gilgamesh, the reigns are very realistic lengths, ranging from 6 years to 36 years. So basically the normal sort of range you see in real history. So it's widely supposed that those later rulers probably were real, or that these references to them and these numbers given to them in the king list are closer to actual historical fact. And Gilgamesh is right in between. So you can see him as this special transitional figure who stood right on the boundary or the threshold from myth to history. And, as I've said repeatedly, history is continuous with myth, right? And this is a great example of it. Gilgamesh has a foot in both worlds, and he's on the threshold. If you imagine sort of looking back into the mists of time, he's the sort of farthest figure we can see in the distance. And it's important, again, that in these little scraps of information that we have from him, from what's called the early dynastic period in Sumer in the 2000s BC, we see that he's connected to the sun deity, to building, and however distantly to the Great Flood. And all of those things come very much into play in the epic that is eventually told about him. Now, it seems that around this time in the early dynastic era in Sumer, Gilgamesh was also revered as a divine figure and specifically as a judge who receives souls in the underworld and judges them. And you can compare him in this way to Anubis and other figures in Egyptian mythology. And he was considered a sort of wise, fair, benevolent judge, much like the solar deity who is his sponsor and patron. So even from this early age, we know that Gilgamesh was associated with death and the afterlife, at the same time that he was seen as a benign figure, a sort of protector. And there are surviving prayers and ritual texts calling on the help and guidance of Gilgamesh. It seems he was invoked and called upon in times of danger, like illness and childbirth. And also he was invoked for rituals for digging wells. So he was associated with well digging, which can seem out of place, but actually the wells were seen as conduits to the underworld and conduits of offerings, especially of water, which was a crucial resource that was needed by the souls of the dead in the underworld. And although he was divine and immortal in this role, he also had been a mortal man who had really faced death, much as the people giving prayers and offerings to him also were anticipating their mortality. So scholars estimate that the historical Gilgamesh might have lived between about 2600 and 2700 BC. Then later, from the late 2000s BC, from around 2100 BC, there have been found several surviving inscribed tablets with stories about Gilgamesh. And specifically, there are 5 that have been found more or less intact that we can read and reconstruct. And they're all written in Sumerian, and they tell different stories and episodes about Gilgamesh's life and career. In one of them, the first one, Gilgamesh and Enkidu venture out to a cedar forest and confront and defeat a sort of monstrous guardian of the forest who's called Huwawa. Then there's another where the two of them fight the bull of heaven, another sort of fearsome creature sent by the gods. In a third one, Gilgamesh defends his city of Uruk against attackers who are besieging it, who come from another state or city called Akka. And ultimately, Gilgamesh prevails, but he pardons and spares the king of Akka. So it sort of reflects his wisdom and magnanimity. In a fourth one, Enkidu ventures into the netherworld, where he is then trapped and cannot come back to the world of the living, but his spirit or shade is able to come up into the upper world and speak to Gilgamesh and tell him about the netherworld and the afterlife. And then fifthly, there is a story of Gilgamesh's death and how he is memorialized and ultimately becomes a sort of judge, a kind of semi-divine judge of the underworld. Okay, so we know that at least these 5 stories about Gilgamesh, and very likely others too, were told about him in the ancient Sumerian era, in the 2000s BC. Now, after new imperial centers arose further up the rivers in Mesopotamia and new empires took over, it seems that each one of them became interested, even fascinated, with Gilgamesh and sought to kind of draw upon the memory, the legacy of this ancient heroic ruler, and all of them in some way translated and retold the stories of Gilgamesh in their own languages. And most specifically, we know that 3 of those 5 surviving ancient Sumerian stories of Gilgamesh were reproduced and eventually integrated into the longer narrative. And all of those 3 are the ones that deal with Gilgamesh and Enkidu. So it seems that in particular, that story of the relationship, the bond between Gilgamesh and Enkidu was particularly compelling and became the core of the sort of great overarching narrative of Gilgamesh. So how did this happen specifically? Well, sometime shortly after Babylon arose and became the new imperial capital of Mesopotamia in the 1700s BC, scribes began to collect and weave together the stories of Gilgamesh into a continuous cycle, or what we now call the Old Babylonian recension. The early stories, as I said, were in Sumerian, in this sort of special, unique language that is not related to any other that we know. The Akkadians and Babylonians spoke Akkadian, which is a Semitic language. So it's related, somewhat closely related even, to Aramaic and also then to Arabic and Hebrew. So Akkadian, after the rise of first Akkad and then Babylon, Akkadian became the main sort of learned language, although people continued to learn Sumerian for the sake of literature, poetry, prayer. Akkadian became the language of sort of government, business, scholarship. So these stories were translated into Akkadian, and more specifically into particular dialects, the sort of learned, high-status dialects of Akkadian, and firstly into what we call Old Babylonian. So Old Babylonian is one dialect, one form of Akkadian that, of course, was the first sort of standard language of the Babylonian Empire. And someone pieced together what seems to be an Old Babylonian recension, sort of weaving together the stories of Gilgamesh into a continuous cycle. And we don't have all of it. We have pieces of it that have been found and reconstructed from various sites, pieces of tablets from different imperial libraries. Also, some bits of the story, such as Gilgamesh and Enkidu venturing into the cedar forest. We know that that was part of this Old Babylonian recension because it seems that students in schools would use it as an exercise text to copy and practice their writing. So a chunk of it has survived and been recovered from the remains of a school. Now, as I mentioned, in around 1500 BC, most of Mesopotamia came under the domination of the Hittites, a powerful new Indo-European empire coming from the uplands to the north. And it seems they translated and revised the story cycle as well. And significant chunks of it, I think over half of the Hittite recension of the epic, have been found by archaeologists excavating the remains of Hattusa, the ancient Hittite capital in what's now Turkey. And it seems that they too, much like the Babylonians, they were interested in Gilgamesh right away, and they produced their recension of the narrative very early on. Now, finally, in the late 1000s BC, maybe somewhere around 1100 or 1200 BC, a Babylonian scholar named Sin-Leki Unini seems to have gathered, retranslated, and revised and expanded the whole cycle into what we call the Standard Babylonian recension. So this one was in another version of the Akkadian language called Standard Babylonian. which was, it seems, a sort of elevated quasi-literary language that was widely shared around the Near East in the 1000s BC. And that one, it seems, was passed down and recopied for hundreds of years thereafter. And about 500 or so years later, when Ashurbanipal is in power, he's the ruler of the Assyrian Empire seated at Nineveh, and he's collecting his massive library, he orders a full copy of this standard Babylonian recension of the Gilgamesh series. But not long after that, in 612 BC, Nineveh, including Ashurbanipal's palace, were attacked and destroyed. And we don't know for certain what was known or said about Gilgamesh for the centuries after that. He was mentioned as some sort of Assyrian deity in some Greek and Roman texts. There was one Roman historian who referred to a story about Gilgamesh's birth, that supposedly his mother was a princess who was fated to give birth to a son who would overthrow the king, so the king locked her up in a tower, and it's this whole sort of weird Rapunzel-like origin story. And that seems to have no relation, as far as we can see, to anything that had been said about Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia. Just sort of awareness of him vaguely as a hero, a demigod, just sort of circulated around the Mediterranean for a while until it died out, and his story, it seems, was forgotten until more than 2,000 years later, when in the 19th century AD, British and Iraqi archaeologists finally excavated the remains of the library of Ashurbanipal. Now, before I get into the impact that it's had and how this epic has been understood and received in the modern world, let's talk about what that text, the Standard Babylonian Recension, actually says, and what we can reconstruct about the overall story using that and other ancient remains. So after having read various translations and retellings and commentaries and analyses on this epic over the past few weeks, I'm just going to give, off the cuff, my own more detailed synopsis of the story as we can piece it together. So the narrative starts off with Gilgamesh ruling the city of Uruk, and he's said to be tall, strong, handsome, an impressive man in all sorts of ways, but he rules exploitatively, and he is constantly requisitioning the men, especially the young men of the city, to work on his projects, or engaging them in fights and contests, and presumably this is how he maintains dominance. And then the women he exploits sexually. So while the people of Uruk are sort of in awe of him, they're also upset. And the women in particular turn to the gods and ask them for help. They complain that Gilgamesh is supposed to be the shepherd of the city, but he's acting more like a predator upon the people. And they persuade the gods to do something. And they meet in council, and they turn to the sort of father of the gods, the heavenly god Anu, who can be seen as kind of the equivalent of the Greek Uranus, and say something has to be done. And Anu decides that they should send Gilgamesh an equal, someone who can match him and bring his behavior under control. And so he has the goddess Aruru, who originally created humankind in the first place. He has Aruru fashion another man out of clay, and she creates Enkidu and sends him down to Earth. And Enkidu is a sort of animalistic, half-animal, wild man. His body is covered in hair. The hair on his head is long like a woman's. And he runs about the steppes with the animal herds, grazing and feeding with antelopes or gazelles. And sometimes he goes to take water at a certain watering hole. And when there, he sometimes finds traps and snares that have been laid to trap the animals. And because he's intelligent and he's dexterous, he dismantles and defuses these traps. And after some time, one of the hunters in this area of the grasslands realizes that this is happening. Someone is tampering with his traps and snares, and he watches, and he sees Enkidu come with one of the herds, and he's horrified by the sight of this enormous, fearsome, wild man. And he goes back to his father and tells what he's seen, and they decide that they should go into the city to this great powerful ruler, Gilgamesh, and ask him to do something. So, much as the people of the city went to the gods, so these sort of rural trapping people go to Gilgamesh and ask for help. And as a solution, Gilgamesh tells the hunter to go to the temple of Ishtar and choose a woman, a hierodule, which is the old technical term for a temple priestess, a priestess of Ishtar in this case, whose ritual duties include sexual acts. So sometimes in old translations, this woman is called a temple prostitute or a harlot, but more recent translations don't use those terms because it seems that this was not a position of shame, but one of a certain degree of status and even sanctity, it seems, in ancient Sumerian society. So Gilgamesh's plan is that if this temple hierodule seduces Enkidu and brings him into the sort of human sexual fold, that then the wild animals will reject him and he'll have to come into civilization. So the hunter takes a woman from the temple named Shamhat out into the countryside to this watering hole where she uncovers her body and waits for Enkidu, who does indeed appear. She seduces him. She teaches him the erotic arts, and they have sexual intercourse for 6 days and 7 nights, until eventually Enkidu is sated and perhaps exhausted with sex, and he goes back out into the wild intending to rejoin these herds of animals that he used to live with. But they run away from him. They sense that he has now changed, and he also finds that he's become weaker and slower, and he can't chase after them. So he's left alone, he doesn't know what to do, and he goes back to Shamhat and sits down at her feet. And she explains to him that he has now joined humankind and that he should come with her to the city of Uruk, where there is this beautiful, tall, strong, formidable ruler, Gilgamesh, who is also a tyrant and preys upon the people. And further, while Shamhat and Enkidu are talking in their sort of bower in the wild, Shamhat reports to Enkidu that Gilgamesh has had 2 prophetic dreams about him. So she seems to have some sort of prophetic power or psychic insight herself. And she tells Enkidu that while they've been out there, Gilgamesh has had 2 dreams, one of a meteorite falling from the sky, and people gather around to look at it, and Gilgamesh is drawn to it like to a woman, and loves it and brings it to his mother. And then he has a further second dream where he finds an axe in the central square of Uruk, and likewise is amazed by it, drawn to it, and presents it to his mother. And Gilgamesh tells of these 2 dreams to his mother, Ninsun, who is a sort of divine being of some sort, a goddess who's called the wild cow. And in both cases, Ninsun tells Gilgamesh that this thing he's found, the meteorite and then the axe, in fact symbolizes a companion, another man, who is going to appear to him and come into his life, and whom he will love like a wife. So this is what Shamhat reports to Enkidu, and then she presses Enkidu to come with him back to Uruk and meet Gilgamesh, this powerful, tyrannical, impressive ruler, and see the splendors of the city with its riches, its pageantry. And Enkidu is persuaded and takes the bait and decides that he will go and challenge Gilgamesh and sort of change the order of things. So he leaves with Shamhat, and they stop over for a period of time at the tent encampment of a shepherding people. So you can say they're getting into sort of the fringe of civilization. And he stops over with these people who are very impressed with him, believe he must be semi-divine, and he learns to eat bread and drink beer, which he's never encountered before. He gets drunk. He grooms, he cleans his hair, and shaves his body so he's no longer hairy. And he also learns the art of the bow and arrow and of hunting. And for a time, he actually serves these shepherding people by going out at night and hunting lions and wolves and other predators who might prey upon their flocks of sheep. So this man who had been sort of one of the wild animals is now changing. He's become a hunter who kills predatory wild animals to protect the domesticated animals. But eventually, of course, Shamhat reminds him we have to go on into the city, into Uruk. So they journey in, and on their way into the city, they encounter a man who's rushing in towards the palace, it seems, and they ask him what's going on. And he says that he's going to serve food at a wedding feast, and furthermore, that the bride of this wedding has been laid out and prepared in the so-called house of marriage, which might be some sort of temple, and that Gilgamesh is going to have sex with her because apparently he claims the right, what in later centuries was called the jus prime nocta, the right of the first night. Gilgamesh claims this privilege to have sex with brides on the night after their wedding before they then, have the union with their husbands. And Enkidu is disgusted and outraged by this, and he rushes into the plaza of the city and catches Gilgamesh before he can enter into this house of marriage, and he puts his foot down and blocks the door. So Gilgamesh is enraged, and the two of them fight and wrestle, and reportedly the walls around them are shaken, the doorpost of the house is broken, and finally Gilgamesh is able to subdue Enkidu and get his sort of knee on Enkidu's back. So Enkidu is amazed and impressed with Gilgamesh's strength and skill and his size and beauty, and it seems as if they start to make friends. They clasp hands. Now, after this point, there's a large gap missing from the standard Babylonian recension, and it's unclear exactly what happens in this part of the narrative, and it's only been pieced together from small fragments from other surviving older tablets. So it seems there's some sort of further interaction here after this wrestling match where they meet Ninsun, who is Gilgamesh's mother and is a divine personage. She is called the Wild Cow, and she seems to be a goddess of some sort. And she comments on Enkidu and says that he grew up in the wild with no father or mother and no brother. He was naked and alone. So it's unclear why she's saying this, maybe to sort of denigrate Enkidu, to say that he's unworthy of being a companion or partner of Gilgamesh. But nonetheless, they seal some sort of partnership anyway. It seems they kiss and embrace. And Enkidu also weeps and cries. And it's not totally clear why he starts weeping and crying, but he says that he feels weak, he's lost his strength and will. And also Gilgamesh, at some point before or just after this, Gilgamesh proposes that the two of them should go out on a journey and on a quest together, specifically into the cedar forest, which is a sort of sacred wild forest somewhere far away, and slay the kind of monstrous figure who guards that forest, who is called Humbaba. So this seems to be the same figure who's called Huwawa in the older Sumerian stories. Now it's in the Babylonian, it's Humbaba. So Enkidu is upset by this proposal by Gilgamesh, and he warns Gilgamesh that when he lived out in the wild, he encountered Humbaba, and he is fearsome and powerful. He's guarded in his lair by 7 entities of unclear nature. It seems like auras or something that no one has really figured out how to translate. And he's also warned off by the elders of the city. So the people of the city now start to speak to Gilgamesh of what to do and not to do, which didn't previously happen. It seems they were afraid, and so they had to go over his head to the gods. But now the elders of the city also warn Gilgamesh, don't put yourself in this unnecessary danger. You're needed here in Uruk. But Gilgamesh is absolutely insistent, and he says that he doesn't want to sit around in this sort of luxurious city and waste his days away. He wants to do something to make his name last. So he's already starting to think here about mortality and what he's going to leave behind. So he and Enkidu go to the workshops and have the armorers make great weapons for them. They then receive well wishes and prayers from the people, and they set out on this first journey. And they go into this cedar forest. They find the sort of great cedar that is near the gateway into the forest, which they then fell and hope to bring back with them to the city. But as they venture further in, they come to a great mountain, and they know that Humbaba's lair is in the side of this mountain. As they approach, they build shelters for themselves, And Gilgamesh has another series of 3 prophetic dreams, each one of some sort of disaster, one of the mountain crumbling and falling and crushing his feet, another of the mountain sort of exploding with fire and ash. And in each of these cases, he tells his dream to Enkidu, and Enkidu interprets it in a positive way, saying this is a sign that we will prevail. Like, for instance, the mountain collapsing, he says symbolizes the defeat of Humbaba. And finally, they approach Humbaba's lair. They see him come out with a sort of blaze of fire and rumble of the earth. And Gilgamesh is frightened and frozen, but Enkidu encourages him on, and they attack Humbaba. And eventually they call on the help and protection of Gilgamesh's sort of patron god, which is Shamash, the sun. And Shamash has also been encouraging them, giving them blessings, watching over them on this whole quest. And so in this moment, when they're really in danger in the midst of the struggle with Humbaba, Shamash sends a series of winds from all directions, which blow in Humbaba's face and sort of blind him and paralyze him. And they're able to capture him and are about to kill him. And Humbaba begins to beg for his life. And he offers them bribes of wealth and power. He, basically gives them the forest. He abandons his guardianship of the forest. He's not such a great guardian. That doesn't work. Then he appeals to Enkidu's sympathy, saying, I too am a sort of outcast creature of the wild like you. I've been alone. But none of this works, and Enkidu is the one who ultimately puts his foot down and says, we can't let him live, we must kill him. So they slay him, and then they cut down 12 great cedar trees from the forest and then float them down the Euphrates River back to Uruk. And we don't know, because there are bits missing, we don't know if there's some further reason or plan for why they wanted these cedar trees, but it's suggestive that perhaps it was for the purpose of building more temples, right? And Gilgamesh over and over again is associated with building. So they bring the cedars back to Uruk, but before they enter back into the city, they bathe, they clean their bloody hands off in the river, they clean themselves, dress themselves, and the goddess Ishtar watches from the walls of Uruk. And remember, she has this great temple, so she sort of, in a sense, dwells in Uruk, and she sees Gilgamesh and is enamored with him, and proposes to him that he should be her lover. And it seems this is something she does many times in ancient Mesopotamian mythology. She finds different mortal creatures and makes them her lovers. But Gilgamesh says no. And not only that, he gives his reasons for refusing. He says that she is a fickle and dangerous lover, that she has destroyed many men in her wake. And he lists off incidents, some of which we know of from other ancient sources and some we do not, but different creatures that she's taken as her lovers and then in one way or another ruined their lives. Among them, he mentions a shepherd whom she took as a lover and then transformed into a wolf. Another was a bird and she broke his wings. And basically, he just completely runs her into the ground. And she is humiliated and furious. And she goes back to the Council of the Gods and demands to her father, the heavenly god Anu, that he give to her the bowl of heaven in order to punish Gilgamesh and Enkidu and perhaps the whole city of Uruk. Now, Anu is reluctant, and so Ishtar threatens that she might open the gates of the underworld and allow the dead to swarm to the upper world and eat with the living. And this is horrifying to everyone involved. And so Anu relents and gives her charge of the Bull of Heaven, and she releases it to attack Uruk. And the bull reportedly rampages around the city, destroying fields, stomping and opening up gaps in the earth into which hundreds of people fall. It's just a reign of destruction. Until again, Enkidu and Gilgamesh are able to regroup, attack the bull, fight it, and subdue it. And Enkidu grabs onto its tail while Gilgamesh stabs the bull in the neck and slays it. And finally, just to add insult to injury, Enkidu actually cuts one of the hind legs off of the Bull of Heaven and hurls it at Ishtar, saying, "Here's your stupid bull, and if I could get a hold of you, I would do the same thing to you." So they've won another victory, and they march together triumphantly into the city. They boast about how strong and handsome they are, and especially Gilgamesh is saying, "Who's the handsomest of men? It's me." And they go into their palace, and they have a feast, and then they go to bed. And as they sleep that night, Enkidu now has a prophetic dream. So previously it's been Gilgamesh, now Enkidu has a prophetic dream in which he sees the council of the gods convening and agreeing that Gilgamesh and Enkidu have gone too far. Ishtar is furious, so are some of the other gods. Shamash tries to defend Gilgamesh and Enkidu, but the rest of the gods agree that the two of them have to be punished in some way. And what they eventually agree on is that Enkidu, because he was the one who did that sort of final mocking, blasphemous insult to Ishtar, that Enkidu should die. So after he has this dream, Enkidu falls ill and gets worse and worse, and Gilgamesh is distraught, and finally Enkidu dies. Gilgamesh is in deep grief. He refuses to give up Enkidu's body for several days. He's in deep denial until finally the body is so decayed that he has to allow it to be interred. And he makes very elaborate funeral offerings to the gods in honor of Enkidu and in hopes that he will have a comfortable afterlife, such as it is in the sort of dark, dreary netherworld. Now, after he at least comes to terms to some degree with Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh is now horrified by the idea of his own mortality and the thought that he is going to one day or another face the same fate, and his body will waste away and he'll be consigned to oblivion in the netherworld. And he firstly wants to understand why this is so and whether there's any way that he can escape this fate. And so he sets out again from the city, this time alone, and he wears plain clothes of animal skins and wanders the desert until he resolves that he should seek out the one person that he knows of who supposedly is immortal and has escaped death. So the one mortal man who did overcome mortality, and that is his ancestor Utnapishtim. And he knows that Utnapishtim, although he's immortal, he's been sort of banished from the ordinary world to a distant land somewhere on a faraway seashore. And so he sets out roughly in that direction, and he ventures, and there are pieces missing here. We don't know the exact details, but he gets to a mountain pass somewhere far away. He fights with some wild animals, probably lions, and defeats them. Then he ventures further to another higher mountain pass with two peaks on either side and enormous, monstrous scorpion people, a married couple, a male and female scorpion, perched on the two mountaintops overlooking the pass where the sun supposedly rises and sets each day. The scorpion people see him coming. They see that he's ragged and haggard, and also that he is strong and beautiful and must be quasi-divine. And so they actually turn out to be friendly to him and say, "What are you trying to do?" And they again, much as the people of Uruk warned him against setting out to the cedar forest, the scorpion people in this distant mountain pass near the edge of the world, they warn Gilgamesh, "Don't go on, you'll never get there to Utnapishtim. It's too far, it's too dangerous. And the only way to this sort of distant land where Utnapishtim dwells is to go through the great tunnel in the earth that the sun passes through during the nighttime." So there seems to be a very ancient cosmology here where people thought of the earth as flat or as hollow or something like this, and the sun passes under the surface of the earth during the night and passes through a great dark tunnel. So they tell him, well, if you're going to go on, you have to go through this tunnel and you've got to get to the other end within 12 hours, or else the sun will come and burn you up. So again, Gilgamesh is determined, he's insistent, he marches through this tunnel through total darkness, hour after hour after hour, can't see anything. And then finally, just in time after 12 hours, he reaches the other end. And he comes out into a lush garden land where there are trees and shrubs with jewels like emeralds and pearls and carnelians growing on them like fruits. And he continues through this garden searching for someone, and he comes to an inn. as if there's someone there waiting for him, for any sort of wayward traveler, mortal or immortal, who might venture out to this distant garden. And the inn is inhabited by a divine immortal barmaid or beer maid named Shiduri. And she is terrified by his presence. Now, at this point, he looks gaunt, haggard. She runs inside, locks the door. But he insists on knowing how he can get to Utnapishtim. And again, Shiduri, just like all these other people, warns him off. No, this is impossible. You should go back home. She tells him to enjoy his life, be intimate with his wife, take care of his children, enjoy what you have. Everyone has to die. But he still doesn't accept this. And finally, Shiduri tells Gilgamesh, if you continue on down to the seashore, you may find the divine boatman named Urshanabi, who periodically ventures out onto the sea, the sort of sea of death, which if any mortal person touches it, they'll die, crosses that water to the distant island where Utnapishtim lives. So he finds Urshanabi. There's some sort of problem or misunderstanding. He destroys some sort of stone objects of some significance that are supposed to facilitate the journey over the waters of death. So as a replacement, he has to gather a bunch of poles from the forest, take them on the boat, and pole his way across the water for days until they get to the island of Utnapishtim. He goes ashore, finds the man, is sort of underwhelmed. He's sort of a small, old, curmudgeonly man, and insists, I need to know how one overcomes death. And Utnapishtim is resistant again, but Gilgamesh at this point points out, it must be possible because you're just an ordinary little man like me, and you're immortal, so how did this come about? And this is where we get an extended story within a story. You could say a sort of extended flashback, where Utnapishtim tells the tale of the Great Flood. So he explains that he was once the king many, many generations ago. He was the king of another Sumerian city called Shuruppak. And while he dwelt there, the gods came together and resolved to destroy humankind. And there's another gap missing here. So from this standard Babylonian recension, we don't know, the piece is missing that tells the reason why the gods wanted to do this. But there is another somewhat similar Babylonian myth that has survived called the epic, although it's not really an epic, but the narrative of Atrahasis. And in this narrative, which in many ways is very similar to this passage in Gilgamesh, the reason is that the human beings are making noise in their burgeoning cities and in their forges and mines, and this is irritating the gods, especially Enlil, the god of the air and storms. And Enlil is infuriated and tells the other gods that this has to be stopped. And in the Gilgamesh version, it seems that also for some reason Ishtar was a driver of this decision. But for whatever reason, they resolve to destroy humankind with an enormous flood that will wipe them out. Now, one god, namely Ea, the god of the sea, and in the ancient Sumerian versions, he's called Enki, Ea has misgivings. And he decides that there is at least one good man that he likes, and that's this sort of priest king, Utnapishtim, who has been his devotee. But the gods have resolved not to tell humankind about their evil plan. So what Ea does is he sort of sets himself down outside of Utnapishtim's house and starts just talking about what they're doing and what they're planning, and just to, the exterior wall of his house. And maybe if someone inside accidentally hears, well, oops, not my fault. So he makes this sort of loophole for himself. And indirectly, he tells Utnapishtim to prepare a gigantic boat to survive this enormous flood that is coming. And so Utnapishtim starts doing this, and he gathers his family, including his wife, and some craftsmen and woodworkers who will know how to make this boat, and he's prepared for this coming catastrophe. But he asks Ea, what do I tell everyone else in my city when I start building this huge boat and try to escape this flood? And Ea says, well, you should tell them that the gods hate you, especially Enlil, the angry, volatile god of storms. and that you have to leave the city and go away somewhere far away. And once you leave, then your city, Shuruppak, will have prosperity and abundance. And this gambit seems to work. So when the flood comes, Utnapishtim and his family and his servants are able to survive, along with many animals that they have brought on board to survive the huge flood. And they're out there in the storms and rain for weeks. It's terrifying. Eventually, the boat runs aground, and then slowly the storm starts to abate. They send out a series of birds, starting with a dove and eventually a raven. And once they find that the raven doesn't come back, they surmise this means that there is dry land, and they start to open up the doors and gates and hatches of this huge boat. And as they do this, they also set up altars then of sacrifice, 14 altars, to burn meat and spices to appease the gods. And as this has all been going on, the flood and this final end of the storm, the gods are distraught. They realize that they have created a disaster outside their control. They run away and hide, and the text says they cower like stray dogs against a wall. When they finally see these sacrificial offerings coming up, they supposedly swarm onto the altars like flies. So there's this suggestion they're sort of hungry or starving after wiping out humankind. And Ishtar in particular is remorseful and says, I can't believe I helped to bring on this horrible disaster. These people were my creation, and now I've destroyed them, and we can never let anything like this happen again. And she points to her jewels, her lapis jewels that she's wearing, and says, I will now always wear these as a reminder of this terrible catastrophe and to ensure that it will never happen again. And moreover, the other gods, who are also remorseful and distraught, sort of gang up on Enlil, blame this whole disaster on him. And as a sort of apology, Enlil then goes into this boat and approaches Utnapishtim and his wife and has them kneel, and he pronounces blessings on them and says that they will now forever be immortal, just like the gods. Now, it seems for some reason Utnapishtim and his wife, now that they are immortal, they can't or don't want to live among the rest of humankind that then goes out to repopulate the earth. And instead, they dwell on this island out at the mouths of the rivers. That's how they describe this sort of distant shore where they live. So having told this story, Utnapishtim basically makes it clear, look, the gods aren't going to give you this gift that they gave to me and my wife. That was a special one-time event as a result of this one-time unique disaster. And Gilgamesh is still in denial. He won't accept this. So Utnapishtim makes a proposal and says, well, Gilgamesh, sleep is like an analog of death, right? It's something all mortal creatures cannot escape. So how about if you try to stay awake for 7 days and 7 nights? And if you can do that, then maybe you've got a chance at immortality. So Gilgamesh, of course, tries this, but he's exhausted from this long journey, and he immediately falls asleep. And while he's sleeping, Utnapishtim's wife bakes 7 loaves of bread for him, 1 each day, such that then when he wakes up after 7 days, they show him, look at these loaves of bread we've been baking, and the oldest ones are already mildewy and stale, and this is proof that you've been asleep this whole time. So now the reality finally sort of sinks in to Gilgamesh that he's never going to get immortality. And if he can't even escape sleep, there's no way he'll escape death. So he's despairing now. He's ready to turn back. Utnapishtim's wife is compassionate, and she gives him nice, clean clothes with a sort of immortal quality that they will always remain clean. And he bathes and grooms, and they're ready to send him on his way. And before he leaves the island with Ushanabi, the boatman, Utnapishtim's wife sort of takes him aside and says, we can give him one more thing to comfort him on his journey back. So Utnapishtim tells him, I'll give you another secret of the gods, right? The first was the story of the flood and how all of that unfolded. The second now is he tells Gilgamesh, on your way back as you're passing over this sea of the dead, you'll come across a meadow under the water, a sort of green meadow, and there'll be a thorny, weedy plant growing at the bottom. And if you can get to the bottom of the water and retrieve it, it's a kind of herb of life, which if you consume it, it will restore your youth. Right? Your aging will be reversed. So Gilgamesh decides he's going to try this, and he heads back across the water with Urshanabi. And when they get to this meadow, he puts stones on his feet to dive down to the bottom. He gets one of these thorny plants. He's able to swim back up to the surface and get onto the boat. And he's happy. He has something, at least, that he's attained that he can now bring back to Uruk. Eventually, they get back to the shore of the mainland, and he goes ashore and goes to a cool spring pool to again clean himself after this contact with the Sea of the Dead. And he puts the herb down on the shore of this pool. And while he's bathing, a snake comes up out of the deep, snatches the plant, and swims back down presumably into the underworld. And as he escapes, Gilgamesh can see he sheds his skin, right? As if this herb is immediately giving him renewed youth. So Gilgamesh is again distraught and humiliated, and he complains, I've gone on this huge journey and I have nothing to show for it. All I've done is a good deed for a reptile. And some translations actually use that word. So dejected, he finally goes back on his journey together with Urshanabi back to Uruk. And once back in Uruk, he speaks to Urshanabi and points out, look at the great walls of mud-fired brick, look at the great temple, and how splendorous Uruk is. And he actually repeats the exact same lines. There are many repeating lines in this story, but it's very dramatic that here Gilgamesh repeats those exact same lines about the splendor of Uruk, exactly as the speaker, the narrator, did back at the beginning of the whole cycle. So things have come, in a sense, you could say, full circle. But in a way, also, Gilgamesh now has this sort of detachment, like the speaker himself, observing from the point of view of posterity. So perhaps Gilgamesh here is taking comfort, you could say, in his achievements, which he hopes will last despite his mortality. Now, that is where tablet number 11 of this recension ends. And it's easy, as many translators do today, it's easy to say, and that's the end of the epic. But that's really an intervention, because actually, if we look at the tablets of the Standard Babylonian Recension from the Library of Ashurbanipal, there's another tablet. And we know it's part of the same series because it's stamped with the same colophon. It says, Library of Ashurbanipal, He Who Saw the Deep, the Gilgamesh series, Tablet 12. And this one tells another story. And we know that it's a very ancient story because it's a Babylonian revision of a story that was found in ancient Sumerian versions from more than 2,000 years BC. And it's the story of Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the underworld. So in this tale, Gilgamesh and Enkidu are living together in harmony, and Enkidu is described as Gilgamesh's servant. One day, it seems, Gilgamesh goes into a workshop, a carpentry workshop, and he picks up two valuable objects, which are called, I believe, a piku and muku. And it's actually unknown what these are. Some have theorized that it's a drum and a drumstick. But whatever they are, they're very valued by Gilgamesh, and he accidentally drops them into a pit or crevice in the earth, and he's unable to retrieve them, and it seems they've gone all the way down into the netherworld. So Enkidu offers to go down into the netherworld and bring them back. But this is very dangerous. Mortal people don't generally venture into the underworld and come back alive. So Gilgamesh has to pray to the gods and gain permission and advice, and he passes on to Enkidu various instructions of things not to do in the underworld in order not to attract the attention or hostility of the dead spirits, such as don't raise a weapon because they can't have weapons, don't make a lot of noise. So Enkidu goes down to look for the piku and muku, and he breaks these rules. And the underworld spirits seize him and separate his spirit from his body. So now his body is decaying away, and his spirit cannot return. He's now trapped there for eternity. And Gilgamesh is very upset, and again he prays and invokes the gods, and the most that they can do is open up another crevice in the earth through which the spirit of Enkidu can rise and appear as a sort of shade, an incorporeal shade, and speak to Gilgamesh. And he tells him, I've now died. It's a very bleak prospect down here, and he describes the sort of existence of the spirits in the underworld, having to subsist on dust and clay and no water. And that's where the story ends. So this is a very sad ending, you can say, and many translators and commentators see this as a very weird place for the cycle to end. It's incompatible, right? It conflicts with the narrative in the rest of the cycle, where Enkidu dies for a totally different reason, right, as divine punishment for their affront. And also, Enkidu dies in bed in the palace, right? He doesn't venture into the underworld and die there. So the two storylines are incompatible. But it does do certain things. It establishes the connection between Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and death and mortality. And it provides a sort of alternate explanation of why Gilgamesh came to be associated with death in the underworld and why he had this wisdom of death and the afterlife. It also demonstrates the love and connection between Gilgamesh and Enkidu. For whatever reason, it seems that the editors, maybe Sinleki Unini in the 11 or 1200s BC, or maybe someone later at Nineveh, decided that it was important and should be included as the sort of final note on that final 12th tablet of the series. Okay, so that is the story, more or less, that was discovered on these ancient cuneiform tablets with many gaps and missing or damaged lines when the Library of Ashurbanipal was excavated in the 1850s. But it took a very long time after that for this new discovery of this ancient narrative to be translated and for its impact to be felt in the modern world. So let's talk about the impact and the reception that this story has had in the modern world. So the first partial translation of at least one piece of this series appeared in 1872, and it was of just Tablet 11, the part dealing with the Great Flood. And it was this aspect of the Epic of Gilgamesh that actually consumed debate and attention for at least the first 50 years. So this first translation was undertaken by an amateur British scholar who was an engraver and sort of lay student of ancient Babylonian named George Smith. And reportedly, he was looking through some of the tablets that had been recovered from Nineveh in the British Museum. And when he found one that seemed to describe a great flood, he was, of course, enormously excited. And then when he read the section about the people on the ark releasing birds, he recognized the very close similarity to the biblical story, and he reportedly was thunderstruck and jumped up, ran around the room, and started disrobing. Now, over the following weeks, he was able to transcribe and translate tablet number 11, and in December of that year, he gave a presentation at the Society for Biblical Archaeology in London called The Chaldean Account of the Deluge. It was massively attended, and the guests included the Prime Minister, William Gladstone. And his talk caused something of a sensation, which was then only further fed 8 years later when he published this translation in 1880. So the big question that was stirred up by this rediscovery and translation was how to relate this narrative, specifically the flood narrative in Gilgamesh, to the Hebrew Bible. And one can see many uncanny parallels and similarities, which we'll talk about a little later. And there were different ways of viewing and trying to make sense of these similarities. Basically, as I would break it down, 4 different ways of integrating this new knowledge. One was to claim that the Babylonian account corroborates the Bible. It basically bolsters the factual veracity of the biblical story on the assumption that both of them are inspired by the same real event that really took place. Now, there are a number of problems with this notion. One is that while there are these similar and parallel events in the two narratives, the Gilgamesh narrative does not corroborate the theology or the moral message of the biblical story. In the Gilgamesh version, the flood appears to be senseless and arbitrary, As I mentioned in the surviving standard Babylonian recension, the piece is missing that would even tell us about the reasons why the gods wanted to destroy humankind. And it seems to be just the result of wrangling and rivalry among different gods, and not as the sort of just act or just retribution of a single god, as in the biblical book of Genesis. A second way of approaching this situation is to say that the Babylonian account is a corrupted version derived from the Hebrew Bible. So in this version, the Hebrew Bible is the original, and then this story that appears in Gilgamesh is sort of the mangled Babylonian alternative. Now, it's very likely, I would say, that if the epic had been discovered 100 or even just 50 years earlier, then this is probably what most scholars would have thought. But by the 1880s, higher criticism of the biblical text had already taken root and had profound effects. So by that point, it was widely accepted that the Bible was the product of centuries of collection and revision of various sorts of texts, including mythology, folklore, prayer, chronicles, religious and political propaganda, etc. And also scholars had made enormous progress on dating the different texts and even individual passages of the Bible based on historical context, linguistic analysis, archaeology, etc., etc. And they had already dated the Genesis narrative to about the 700s or 800s BC. And hence it was clear, if one applied the same methods to these tablets with the Gilgamesh cycle, it was clear that the Gilgamesh narrative was significantly older, at least several hundred years older. So that basically put paid to this idea that you could claim that the Gilgamesh flood narrative is just a sort of imperfect derivative of the biblical narrative. So this leaves two other options still on the table. One was that the ancient Babylonian epic was the source and inspiration for the biblical myth. So you could reverse the relationship, right? And in this view, the Hebrews would have taken the Babylonian story and revised or cleaned it up. Now, this is what was argued by some German scholars who were the first to translate the epic, or beyond just Tablet 11. It was really Germans who were the most advanced in archaeology, linguistics, anthropology in this era. So it's really taken up by German scholars, and some of them argue this, that the Gilgamesh version is the original, and the biblical version with Noah and the Ark is the imperfect derivative. And specifically in the early 1900s, a German scholar named Friedrich Delitzsch, who was, as it happens, the son of a Lutheran theologian and was a devout Christian, he gave a series of lectures starting in 1902, arguing that the Genesis authors copied their material directly from Gilgamesh. And he gave the first lecture on this theme in 1902 in Berlin, and among the attendees was Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. So you can see this was such a momentous question in this period that heads of state and government are showing up to hear the latest announcements. So he gave this first one in 1902 in Berlin, but subsequently he became so controversial that he was effectively run out of town and had to give his subsequent lectures in other cities in Germany. And his argument was followed up then by another German scholar, Peter Jensen, in a book called Gilgamesh Epos. So he's among the earliest to call this whole narrative an epic. And Jensen argues that all the Old Testament heroes, including Abraham, Moses, and David, were just revised Israelite simulacra of Gilgamesh. Right? All the original material, in his view, went back to the Babylonians and to Gilgamesh. Now, this argument was widely rejected by scholars, but it was very difficult to debunk or to contain in limited channels, because out there in the public, there was great curiosity about what this epic revealed and what it might say about the Bible. And hardly anyone out there in the public had access to the authentic original texts. And hence, sort of scholars and pseudo-scholars could claim almost anything they wanted and get an audience. A bit later in 1921, Delitzsch published a book called The Great Deception, where he sort of builds on this argument about the Old Testament narrative deriving from Gilgamesh, and adds classic anti-Semitic spin, for that period. So this book, The Great Deception, argues that the Old Testament is irretrievably corrupted by Babylonian influences, which of course are untrustworthy because they are polytheist and they're also Eastern and Semitic. And so he argued that Christians should reject the Old Testament entirely in favor of a more pure and supposedly Aryan theology of the New Testament. Now, another way of trying to make sense of this relationship between Gilgamesh and the biblical Genesis is to argue that the two both derive from some common original, which is today, as of yet, lost and unrecovered. In other words, from an even more ancient Near Eastern story, perhaps originating in Mesopotamia or somewhere nearby. And this was argued by the Argentinian-born American scholar at the University of Chicago, Alexander Heidel. So a number of decades later, in 1946, Heidel published a book, The Gilgamesh Epic and Old Testament Parallels. And this book focuses on two main themes, the depictions of the netherworld that we see in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Great Flood. And Heidel goes to great lengths. I read this book and it is quite exhaustive. He goes to great lengths to argue that these two narratives are really very different. For example, in the Bible, there are no references to any offerings to or for the spirits of the dead, and the dead do not come back to life. Now, as I'll mention again later, you might think of the incident of the witch of Endor raising a shade of the prophet Samuel, and Heidel argues that even in incidents like this, where it seems as if the dead can come back to life, it's probably just fakery. And as for the flood, he argues that the similarities between the flood stories in Gilgamesh and the Bible are only superficial, perhaps deriving from some older common folkloric source. But he points out the message is totally different. In the Bible, the story is about sin and morality and redemption, whereas in the Gilgamesh epic, the gods seem to be just petty and fickle, and the whole story seems pointless. So by the time Heidel was writing this book in the 1940s, higher criticism had really penetrated so thoroughly that it was implausible to argue that the Bible was in any way literal fact or that it had been handed down directly from God as is without human revision and invention. So by this point, you could say biblical literalism is intellectually disreputable and basically relegated only to religious seminaries on the sort of fringe of the academic world. And it was taken as basically indisputable in scholarly circles that the Old Testament derived from materials from Near Eastern folklore and mythology. And the question at issue was simply, does the Bible offer theological and moral insight, despite the fact that it is a human historical creation? And reading it, one can see ultimately that Heidel, like Delitzsch before him, is also a Christian apologist. He's just taking a different tack. He wants to rescue the Old Testament from the imputation of Babylonian influence and to make it kosher again, whereas Delitzsch wants to throw it out completely. Now, meanwhile, also significantly, Heidel's book was the first, as far as I've been able to find, it was the first to provide a fairly complete English translation of the whole cycle. Although, interestingly, he leaves the passages describing the sexual intercourse between Enkidu and Shamhat in Latin, sort of out of delicacy. But nonetheless, this seems to be the first extensive English translation of the Gilgamesh cycle, and previous to that, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, it had been found only in German. So if you wanted to read the whole thing, you had to have German. And English-speaking audiences were intrigued, but they knew almost nothing about the rest of the story beyond the flood myth, which had been the big object of debate and controversy. And so through these years, English-speaking writers wrote various fanciful adaptations, often with little resemblance in form or content to the original. And one of the earliest was in 1884, when the American lawyer Leonidas Lisansi Hamilton published a long romantic poem called Ishtar and Izdubar, which is supposedly a sort of version or adaptation of the Gilgamesh story. It completely omits the flood story and focuses in on the supposed romance between Gilgamesh and Ishtar, which is expanded to a longer length than the entire standard Babylonian recension of Gilgamesh and adds on a happy ending. So it has almost no relation to what we've been discussing. And later writers through the years did similar things, making adaptations and commentaries that reflected current tastes and current anxieties, especially in the 20th century. Anxieties about war and destruction, especially during and after World War II, about the psychology of modern man, the supposed sources of human psychological malaise and neurosis, loss of primitive masculinity or human nature. It's drawn upon by Freud, who casts Enkidu as representing primitive man or the libido. Also, Carl Jung and his disciples go further with other characters in the story, such as Humbaba and Ishtar, taken to represent father and mother figures or archetypes. And in recent times, it's been used as a parable for destruction of nature and the environment, or about Western intervention in the Middle East, especially after the U.S. attack on Iraq, since this, most ancient of narratives originally comes from Iraq. Now, meanwhile, as all of this is going on, only very slowly and gradually do people gain access to and read translations of the original text and appreciate its literary style and power. Not just these figures and characters coming from this ancient story, but the actual. So as I said, the first translations were in German, and it seems it did influence at least some German modernists. 2 translations were published in German in 1911 and 1916, and both of them were read voraciously and ecstatically by the modernist poet Rainer Maria Rilke. He was reportedly dumbstruck by the experience. He said that reading the Epic of Gilgamesh was ungeheuer or stupendous. He said it was, quote, the greatest thing that can happen to a person. He called the cycle das Epos der Todesfurcht, or the Epic of the Fear of Death. And his publisher's wife suggested to him that he make his own revised edition of the epic, but he declined, saying that the story was meant to be read aloud, not on the page. And he said that he had read it aloud with his daughter. And one could ask, does this have any influence then on Rilke's work? And we don't know for certain in any direct way, but there is an important clue in a later letter that he wrote to a friend where he made reference to the Gilgamesh story, and he referred to the gaps that are missing, which he said invited the involvement of the reader. And this was very prescient. It seems the fragmentary nature of the original texts can serve to create tension and ambiguity, which are in keeping with the modernist movement, with its mood of skepticism, its sense of incompleteness, the futility of final definite answers, and also fascination with the primitive. And also, in addition to its fragmentary state, the great variety of forms and genres and the striking, stark imagery, including often of violence and grief, all of these can be seen as inspirations for modernist works, such as, I would say, for example, T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land. And I haven't seen much comment, and I haven't been able to find definitely whether T.S. Eliot read a translation of Gilgamesh. But we do know that Eliot read French theological commentaries on Gilgamesh, and he incorporated stories and figures from it into his verse play, The Family Reunion, which was first performed in 1939. And this is a detective story patterned upon the idea of the hero's journey, journeying from guilt to redemption. And it seems this was the sort of common conceptual framework, especially in the mid-20th century, for understanding myths and legends and epics, and Gilgamesh was sort of slotted into this pattern. And, as I'll refer to again later, there is validity to that. A lot can be drawn from that perspective, but it can also be limiting. Now, even still, at this point, complete translations of Gilgamesh were not very widely read. As I mentioned, the first full English translation, it seems, was published as an appendix in Heidel's book, The Epic of Gilgamesh and Old Testament Parallels. It seems the first book to present a relatively readable, continuous narrative for a wide reading audience, came out in 1960, and it is the Penguin edition of a prose translation by the British scholar N.K. Sandars. And in this translation, Sandars does several things that make the text more accessible or familiar or easier to assimilate, you could say, for a modern audience. So as I said, it's in prose, like a novel, which can seem less daunting to read on the page than verse. The narrative fills in or papers over the gaps. So there are no brackets and dashes breaking up the text on the page. It weaves a continuous narrative, even if it means inventing some lines. And Sandars broke the text into 7 chapters organized by incidents, which can be easier and clearer of a structure than the 12 tablets on which the narrative was discovered. And she uses also archaizing language, which can be very reminiscent, for example, of the King James Bible. So perhaps Sandars figured that this is what the audience would expect Near Eastern ancient texts to look and sound like. So there are a lot of very biblical sounding verbs like forsake and beseech, and also some odd phrases that are a bit hard to understand or visualize from my point of view, but that sound reminiscent of the King James Bible. For example, in the scene where Enkidu has died and Gilgamesh is still holding on to his body and refuses to give it up for burial for days, Gilgamesh says that I held on to his body for 6 days and 7 nights until, quote, the worm fastened upon him. Now, when I read that, I thought maybe that means something. It's, obviously it's about death and the breakdown of the body, but maybe it's just a metaphor, or maybe it's borrowed from the King James Bible. I don't know. But finally, Sandars also changes the beginning and end of the narrative, probably to seem more like a Greek epic. So for one thing, she lops off the Tablet 12 story, which, as I talked about, is about Enkidu going down into the netherworld where he then is entrapped, but his spirit appears as a sort of shade to Gilgamesh. She takes this off, right? It seems out of place, and replaces it with instead a version of the Sumerian story of the death of Gilgamesh, which ends with his funeral and his sort of taking up a judgeship in the underworld. And this can seem more like an appropriate closing to the cycle, right? It's elegiac, and it celebrates and centers on the central hero of Gilgamesh, not on the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu. And as for the beginning, she adds in at least one line that simply isn't there in the ancient text. So if you open up her book, the narrative begins with the line, quote, I will proclaim to the world the deeds of Gilgamesh. Now, this brings in, for one thing, a first-person speaker, I. And this can be seen to evoke oral literature, right, like Homer's epics, and especially the Odyssey, right, which begins also with this first-person invocation, sing in me, O Muse, and through me tell the story. So there are a lot of sort of strategies and compromises here that Sandars uses to make this text speak to a modern audience in a way that she believes will make sense to them. And this is the version that first introduces millions of people to the actual full story of the Gilgamesh cycle, and it has an enormous lasting influence on writers and even on scholars, many of whom first, as young people, first encounter the Epic of Gilgamesh through this edition. Now, subsequently in the 70s and 80s, especially after some of those scholars who were struck and inspired by Sandars' edition, as they come of age, they start to make some early efforts to create more faithful translations that stick closer to the original wording and that render the text in verse like the original. But this process presents enormous difficulties, including, for one thing, what to do with the gaps. And there's been a kind of push and pull over these questions and problems over about the last 25 years, and that's when the closest translations, you could say, the ones that are considered the most faithful reproductions, have come out. So firstly, in 1999, a verse translation by Andrew George was published, the British scholar Andrew George, and this is a translation of just the first 11 tablets of the cycle, ending with Gilgamesh's return to Uruk. It also includes translations of other Gilgamesh stories, including the ancient Sumerian stories and Tablet 11, with the Netherworld story, put in appendices at the end. And this edition does leave some of the gaps visible on the page, with brackets and italics around missing lines and also uncertain words. It also uses much more contemporary phrasing, at times almost colloquial, but very vivid, and it can lead to very striking imagery. Some of the lines arguably are almost shocking. So, for example, I mentioned how in Sandars' translation, there's that passage where Gilgamesh says that he has held on to Enkidu's body until the worm fastened upon him. In Andrew George's translation, it says he held on to his body until a maggot fell from his nostril. So you can see there, it's this almost harrowingly vivid image, and one that you can really imagine, I think, shocking Gilgamesh out of his stupor and out of his denial. And Andrew George's version depended on a lot of the latest evolving scholarship on the Akkadian language and philology, including from more recent archaeological discoveries. And so just 4 years later, in 2003, George came out with another massive critical edition, this one more transparent, you could say, than the 1999 edition, but also very fragmentary and more difficult to follow. So it's more for experts and scholars. And this one includes transcriptions of the ancient Akkadian texts of all 12 tablets, with translations showing the gaps and the damaged portions, and also presenting the older texts, like the surviving pieces of the Old Babylonian recension and the Hittite recension, in appendices. So this seems to be widely considered the most authoritative edition yet of the entire epic. But nonetheless, in 2019, the American scholar Benjamin Foster produced another edition that can be seen as a sort of compromise. So on the one hand, it tries to fill in all of the gaps, using older tablets and recensions in order to make a complete continuous narrative, like N.K. Sandars' 1960 prose translation. But meanwhile, it gives explanatory notes marking where the standard Babylonian recension is incomplete or broken, and which lines he is taking and borrowing from other older versions. So in trying to understand passages of this epic for this lecture, I have used both, right? Andrew George and Benjamin Foster's translations, and I've compared and combined them, for instance, in putting together that sort of opening that I read earlier. Now, these new translations of the epic have allowed for more various adaptations into new genres and media. There have been some children's versions, often with illustrations. And as you can imagine, this can be a little awkward considering some of the themes of sex and death that come into the story. But for instance, there was an illustrated children's version published by Barbara Bryson in 1967, where the story is just slightly cleaned up. For instance, in the opening, when the people of Uruk are complaining to the gods, they complain that they're always being made to build walls higher and higher. They have no time for leisure or play. No marriages are made. But it leaves out the original element that Gilgamesh preyed upon the women sexually. And marriages did happen in Uruk, according to the ancient recensions. But Gilgamesh claimed, as we saw, this right of the first night with the bride. So that's kind of, conveniently left out. And I skipped, of course, forward to the ending. Like, where does she end this? And the ending is very tragic. It ends with the conjuring up of the shade of Enkidu, and then Gilgamesh dies of grief. So, pretty heavy stuff, I would think, for a children's picture book. But there are also adaptations for stage, such as a verse play composed by the American poet Yusuf Komunyakaa, which came out in 2006. And this has a chorus like a Greek tragedy. So it's sort of, reworking the story to be kind of Sophoclean, fitted into more of what we think of as the classical corpus. And then as for film, I always like to talk about film. it seems that there have only really been film versions of Gilgamesh after 2000. I did see on YouTube it seems there is a Hungarian version from the 1960s where they're kind of dressed up in these ancient costumes, and meanwhile the background is like green screen animations. It doesn't look at all close to what I would understand is the Gilgamesh story. It's one of these instances where the name was used sort of for interest by association, but it's really not like the original at all. And that seems to have happened in more recent years too, with a lot of short films, mostly animated. Perhaps because the settings are so exotic and difficult to stage, they're mostly animated. And again, often just the name is invoked for the allure of antiquity, but there's really little connection in terms of the content. For example, there's a 2003 animated series which actually takes place in the future, not in the distant past. There was a feature film made in Bahrain in 2011, but I haven't found much information about it. Just this year, in 2024, it seems that a Kurdish-American director named Cardozi came out with a small, self-funded, independent film called Where is Gilgamesh? And this is about a museum security guard trying to track down and recover stolen tablets from art thieves and art traffickers. So you can see a sort of interesting conscious resonance, right, of the ancient themes, right? So Gilgamesh goes searching for immortality, and here there are modern people going out and searching for Gilgamesh. Now, all of that being said, as far as I can see, there's never been any major or even mid-level Hollywood or Bollywood film of the Epic of Gilgamesh. I don't know why that is. Perhaps it's confusion over how it would look and how would it be filmed. And maybe also because it just doesn't have as much cachet already built in. It doesn't have the name recognition of Greek or Indian myths or the Bible. And so I would say this story has yet to be seriously dramatized using our latest popular media. However, just as an interesting final note, it seems that just this year, a small independent filmmaker named Zeb Haradon produced an AI animated version. And the conceit is that archaeologists have found ancient film reels from a sort of ancient lost cinema technology from Uruk. And these film reels show fragmentary scenes of the life of Gilgamesh in black and white. And it's interesting that this video, this sort of 1 hour video, preserves, I think, the fragmentary nature of the story, right? In keeping with this sort of allure to modern audiences of the half-lost, half-preserved epic. And it also assimilates the story to the modern genre of found footage, right? Much like the modernist poets who were drawn to the fragmentation and gaps in the ancient narrative. And also, I would say, lastly, this captures a great irony that Gilgamesh is at once both ancient and modern. And as I said before, it is both the oldest story in our canon and the newest at one and the same time. And this is illustrated in this instance by recreating scenes from this deeply ancient story using the latest technology, right? AI animation. This sort of irony has often been noted before in relation to the Epic of Gilgamesh, just like all the way back in the 1850s, when the discovery of the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh with this huge cache of ancient cuneiform tablets was announced to the world via telegraph. And people noted this at the time, that this seemed to be sort of coming full circle, right? That these ancient stories and texts are in the oldest medium ever found, and now here they are being transmitted almost instantaneously around the world on this sort of unimaginably new technology. So that, I think, more or less completes the cycle of the meta-history, the story of Gilgamesh. And hopefully soon, before the end of October, I'll post a second part looking at the literary qualities, the way the epic is composed, and the different levels of meaning, psychological, political, that one can find in the story and its symbolism. So hopefully that will be coming soon, and thank you again to my patrons. And as I said, this lecture is brought to you by the letter Y. So I would like to thank my current active patrons whose names begin with Y, Yulia Gilic and Yana. Thank you.